The static crackled in the dark, an urgent voice breaking through the hum of cockpit controls. Mayday, Mayday! This is AA 2317. Medical emergency on board, requesting priority landing at SFO. The voice belonged to Captain Gideon Ryder Hawthorne, steady and assured, betraying none of the calculated intensity that simmered beneath his polished exterior. To his crew and passengers, he was a model of control, calm under pressure, commanding in the cockpit. At just 32, he was the youngest captain in American Airlines history, a man whose meteoric rise had been attributed to sheer talent, discipline, and unwavering focus. His flight log was pristine, his landings surgical in precision, his reputation impeccable. But what no one knew, not his crew, not his airline, not even his wife, was that Gideon Hawthorne was already living on borrowed time. This was not just the story of an aviation emergency. It was the beginning of the end of an elaborate double life, one that unraveled with the precision of a carefully set clock ticking toward inevitable disaster. The morning of January 17th began as just another routine transcontinental flight. American Airlines Flight 2317, scheduled from New York to San Francisco, soared effortlessly at 35,000 feet. The sky was clear, the flight uneventful, until the medical emergency in first class. The passenger, a woman in her late 40s, had collapsed mid-flight, her body seizing violently as flight attendants scrambled to assist. And then, from seat 3A, a woman stood up. Dr. Celeste Moreno, 26 years old, the youngest neurosurgery resident at UCSF, moved with quiet confidence. Her long black hair fell forward as she assessed the patient, directing flight attendants with the authority of someone accustomed to holding lives in her hands. Gideon watched her through the cockpit door, his mind already at work. He had read her name before takeoff, memorized the details from the passenger manifest, a habit of his. It was always useful to know people before meeting them. His eyes traced the rolled-up silk sleeves of her emerald blouse, the delicate wristwatch, the way she carried herself with effortless precision. He noted every detail, how she touched her necklace when thinking, how she spoke in clipped, efficient sentences, how she never hesitated before making a decision. The perfect woman, he thought. And in time, she would be his perfect wife. Landing in 8 minutes. His voice carried smoothly over the intercom, the same voice that had charmed passengers, crew, and even the FAA officials who oversaw his career. The landing itself was flawless, as expected, a testament to his skill, his mastery over the machine beneath him. In the chaos of the emergency, Gideon made his first move. As the medics escorted the patient off the plane, he approached Celeste. "You handled that like a captain yourself," he said, his smile carefully measured, charming but not overbearing. She returned a polite nod, her sharp eyes assessing him as much as he was assessing her. "I like fixing things others consider impossible," she replied. That sentence would haunt her years later when she realized Gideon Hawthorne had been an impossible problem all along. Their romance unfolded with mathematical precision, every piece falling into place exactly as Gideon intended. It was textbook seduction, but executed at a level most men couldn't comprehend. He studied her background, her Vietnamese heritage, her immigrant parents' sacrifices, her grueling hours at the hospital, her obsession with control, herself. He discovered her weaknesses, her need for validation, and then piece by piece he became the man she needed him to be. There were weekend trips to Paris if whisking her away from the sterile walls of the hospital proved he understood balance. There were late-night conversations where he matched her intellectual intensity, discussing medicine with the same ease he spoke of aerodynamics. Every moment was carefully curated, every encounter engineered for maximum effect. By the time he proposed at Muir Beach, the moment felt as organic as the ocean tide, a masterstroke of planning that masked the cold precision behind it. Gideon had timed it to perfection. The setting sun bathed Celeste in warm light. The hand-selected engagement ring, a classic, elegant diamond, glittered in the golden hour glow. The ring was not an impulsive purchase. He had researched her taste, consulted jewelers, ensured it was exactly what she would have chosen herself. When she said yes, he knew she would. Everything had gone according to plan. Their wedding was a spectacle. The Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, a carefully crafted guest list, a ceremony that felt straight out of a movie. Her traditional Vietnamese family was there, beaming with pride. His side of the church was sparse, a fictional tragedy carefully woven into his backstory. His parents, he had told Celeste, were dead. Another lie. They moved into a Victorian home in Pacific Heights, a storybook life meticulously curated. The telescope by the bay window for late-night stargazing. The shared study, with its carefully arranged medical journals and flight manuals. The wine cellar, stocked with Celeste's favorite vintages. A home built for the illusion of permanence. But Gideon had never been a man for permanence. And even as Celeste planned for their future, he was already plotting his escape. The first sign should have been the restlessness. The way Gideon's hand twitched when she spoke of children. The way he checked his phone during their anniversaries. The way his eyes lingered too long on the departure schedules pinned to their refrigerator. At first, Celeste ignored it. She was busy, after all. Medicine consumed her. She had married a pilot. What was a little distance? But Gideon wasn't just a pilot. He was a man with another life waiting for him, 2,000 miles away. He had mastered the art of compartmentalization. At 35,000 feet, he was Captain Hawthorne, the golden boy of American Airlines. At home, he was the devoted husband, the charming intellectual, the man who always said the right things. And yet, neither of these versions of himself were real. The real Gideon Hawthorne, the man who lived between lies, who manipulated, who engineered his world like a flight plan, was already slipping away. Because on a stormy night in Chicago, a new chapter of deception was about to begin. And this time, even he wouldn't be able to land it safely. The rain lashed against the tarmac at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, turning the runways into mirrors reflecting flashes of lightning. Inside the first-class lounge, the mood was a stark contrast. Warm, inviting, filled with the low hum of conversations and the occasional clink of whiskey tumblers meeting polished marble countertops. And there she was, Isle Carrington, 25 years old, untamed red curls, a devil-may-care grin, a woman who radiated rebellion. She sat at the far end of the bar, drumming her fingers against a half-empty glass of whiskey, a splash of crimson against the sterile, beige-toned corporate world of an airport lounge. Gideon Hawthorne spotted her instantly. He didn't just see her, he studied her. She wasn't like Celeste. There was no structured perfection, no air of careful calculation. She was wild, unpredictable, untamed, and dangerous. Gideon approached with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. "Looks like we're all stuck here tonight," he said, sliding onto the leather seat beside her, exuding the charm that had won over countless flight crews and unsuspecting passengers. Carrie didn't even glance at him at first, just smirked into her whiskey glass. Then, slowly, she turned, her green eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his carefully constructed world flicker, just for a second. "Good thing I know how to make my own fun, Captain." She reached into her vintage leather bag and pulled out a small silver flask, setting it on the counter between them. An unspoken invitation. Gideon could feel it already. That pull, that instinct for destruction that lived beneath the surface of his perfectly curated life. And for the first time in years, he leaned into it. 4 hours later, they were running through the empty airport terminal, her laughter echoing against the glass walls as security guards turned a blind eye. Gideon Hawthorne's uniform still commanded respect, even when breaking rules. They ended up in the abandoned observation deck, watching the storm unleash hell on the runways while they sipped whiskey and exchanged secrets neither had told another soul. And then, in a moment of recklessness, or perhaps something deeper, Gideon did something he never did. He told the truth. "My parents aren't dead," he confessed, watching the storm instead of her reaction. "They're in federal prison for investment fraud. I rewrote my entire history to become the youngest captain in American Airlines." And Carrie? She didn't flinch. She just leaned in, studying him the way he had studied her, and whispered back, "I escaped an abusive marriage at 23. Art saved me. Now I save others through it, survivors, outcasts, anyone society tries to silence." For the first time in years, Gideon felt something crack in his carefully curated mask. That night, in the abandoned airport observation deck with the storm raging outside, they collided like two forces of nature. It was nothing like the structured, practiced intimacy he had with Celeste. This was primal, desperate, chaotic, or maybe just another performance in his lifelong act. The FBI would later debate this point extensively. From that night on, Carrie became his new fixation. And Gideon Hawthorne did what he did best. He studied her. He learned her patterns. He became exactly what she needed. And in time, he would make her his second wife. For most men, living two lives would be impossible. For Gideon Hawthorne, it was just another logistical challenge, a flight plan that had to be executed with precision. He built a second identity in Chicago, just as perfect as the one he had in San Francisco. He manipulated flight schedules to sync layovers with time spent in Chicago. He created false business expenses to justify transactions. He rented an apartment in Wicker Park under a shell company, mirroring the sophistication of his Pacific Heights home. He kept two separate phones, two credit cards, even wore two different colognes, one for Celeste, one for Carrie. It was flawless, and it would have worked forever. Except Gideon had never been a man who could resist pushing limits. The moment he proposed to Carrie, the lie became too real to escape. The engagement was nothing like Celeste's. No Paris getaways, no carefully rehearsed timing, no pressure from her family. Instead, he rented a small plane, paid in cash, and flew them low over Lake Michigan at sunset. Carrie laughed, hair whipping in the wind, her hands outstretched like she could touch the sky. "Marry me," Gideon said. She turned, surprised. "Are you serious?" He pulled a black opal ring from his pocket, chaotic and untamed like her. "I know we'll have to keep it quiet because of airline politics, but I want you to be mine." And Carrie? She didn't hesitate, because in her mind, Gideon Hawthorne was too good to be true. And for once, she was right. The wedding was quick, impulsive, reckless. A 24-hour chapel, fake names on the license, no photographs allowed. She wore a red dress, bare feet, ankle bells jingling as they kissed. She thought it was romantic. She didn't know it was another red flag. Gideon was now a man with two homes, two women, two carefully curated worlds. In San Francisco, Celeste. Elegant, ambitious, perfect. The wife who made him feel like a rising star. The woman whose presence elevated his status, whose world fit into his facade of success. In Chicago, Carrie, wild, unfiltered, intoxicating. The wife who made him feel free, alive, reckless. The woman who let him be someone else entirely, who never questioned why he needed to disappear. And for a while, he maintained both lives flawlessly. He curated stories to never mix up details. He never left a trace of one world in the other. He was a master of deception, until one day the first crack appeared. The signs were small at first, a flight delay that nearly caused overlap, a text message sent to the wrong phone, a Chicago credit card charge mistakenly used in San Francisco. But Gideon was too good, too careful, until the day Carrie whispered two words that shattered his illusion of control. "I'm pregnant." For the first time in his life, Gideon Hawthorne felt turbulence he couldn't navigate. Twins, two lives he never planned for. At the same time, in San Francisco, Celeste began talking about starting a family. The walls of his carefully built double existence were closing in, and the storm he had been outrunning for years was about to hit him head-on, because both women thought they were his only wife, and very soon they would find out the truth. For months, Gideon Hawthorne had played the most dangerous game of his life, navigating two marriages with the same precision he commanded at 35,000 feet. But no flight plan is flawless, and cracks, small, barely visible at first, began forming beneath his meticulously constructed world. The first warning sign was subtle, a Chicago layover that ran too long. A last-minute flight delay that nearly left him in Kari's bed while Celeste waited for him at a San Francisco gala. A wrong credit card used in the wrong city. Gideon had always been precise, but for the first time, he had to improvise. It was a house of cards, held together by two sets of credit cards, meticulously assigned to different locations, two email accounts, one for each marriage, two phones, both always fully charged, both always separated, two wardrobes, carefully curated to never overlap. But maintaining this level of deception required constant effort, and the moment his energy slipped, the entire structure started to sway. The real trouble started when other people began to notice. Gideon had always been meticulous about controlling perception, but people see what they aren't supposed to when you start making mistakes. Luna Mackenzie, senior flight attendant, had been in the airline industry for 2 decades. She had seen pilots cheat on their wives before. But Gideon Hawthorne, he was different, too careful, too polished, and suddenly too distracted. It started with small things. Forgetting a crew member's name, something he never did. Missing a radio call during turbulence. Arriving late to the cockpit for pre-flight checks just by a minute or two. He was slipping, and Luna took notes. April 12th, San Francisco. Gideon had spent the weekend with Carrie in Chicago, promising her he'd be back the following Friday. What she didn't know was that he was already due at Celeste's hospital fundraiser in San Francisco that night. The problem? A storm in Denver delayed his connecting flight. For the first time, his worlds nearly collided. Kari waited for him at O'Hare. Phone in hand, she sent a text. "I miss you. Can't wait for Friday." Gideon was in a San Francisco hotel ballroom, standing beside Celeste, smiling for cameras, shaking hands with donors. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and Celeste noticed. She never questioned him before, but tonight something in his expression made her pause. He excused himself from the gala, locked himself in a restroom stall, and for the first time he panicked, because he wasn't just managing a double life anymore. He was managing 2 pregnancies, and time was running out. With each passing month, Gideon was losing grip on his carefully controlled deception. May 18th, he bought Carrie's prenatal vitamins on Celeste's pharmacy account. June 2nd, his flight schedule suddenly changed after Celeste announced she wanted to start IVF. And then, the first true disaster happened. June 15th, Chicago. Carrie had planned a private gallery event showcasing her latest paintings. Gideon, as her devoted husband, was supposed to be there. What he didn't know was that one of Carrie's newest featured artists was a neurosurgeon. And when she introduced the artist to the crowd, the man spoke excitedly about his idol, Dr. Celeste Moreno, the revolutionary surgeon from San Francisco. Gideon felt his heart stop. The gallery erupted in whispers, because one of the guests recognized the name. And Carrie? She noticed the sudden tension in Gideon's face. She watched his reaction, and for the first time, doubt flickered in her eyes. The real evidence of his unraveling wasn't emotional, it was financial. Luna Mackenzie, the senior flight attendant, had been quietly investigating Gideon for weeks. She had tracked flight routes, she had noted unusual layovers, and then she found something he hadn't accounted for, a fraud department flag. Because on June 28th, Gideon Hawthorne had accidentally used his Chicago credit card in San Francisco. That transaction, one single mistake, was the crack that split everything open. When Luna presented her suspicions to First Officer Jade Martinez, the picture became clearer. Jade had already noticed Gideon's slipping, the erratic behavior, the near-missed radio calls, the occasional trembling hands during turbulence. So when Luna handed her a file with Gideon's flight patterns, everything clicked into place. They took it to the FAA, and the FAA launched a silent investigation. Gideon Hawthorne was running out of airspace, and soon he would have no place left to land. For years, Gideon Hawthorne had controlled every detail of his double life with mathematical precision. Every layover, every excuse, every moment spent between San Francisco and Chicago had been calculated, ensuring neither of his 2 wives would ever suspect a thing. But now the walls were closing in. The FAA investigation was active. His colleagues were tracking his erratic behavior. Carrie was asking questions. Celeste was pushing for a family. And worst of all, Carrie was pregnant with twins. Gideon had always been able to outrun his own lies, until now, because the moment he had spent years avoiding was finally here. His 2 lives were about to collide, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. July 10th, a text from Carrie. "We need to talk when you get back." It was simple, but Gideon felt his entire world tilt the moment he read it. She knew something, or she suspected enough to start digging. He needed to redirect her, distract her, control the narrative before it spiraled out of his hands. He booked an earlier flight to Chicago than planned. He arrived at their Wicker Park apartment late that night, carrying a bottle of wine and a rehearsed excuse. But when Carrie opened the door, she wasn't smiling. She stood there, arms crossed, eyes sharp. And Gideon knew this was different. Inside, she handed him a printout, a billing statement, for a medical expense charged in San Francisco, a charge that had nothing to do with her, a charge that belonged to Celeste's fertility clinic. Gideon felt his pulse spike. He could fix this. He just needed to stay calm. "It's a mistake," he said smoothly, already constructing the lie in his head. "Airlines mix up details all the time. I'll call and—" "Don't," Carrie cut him off. Her voice was quiet, controlled, dangerous. "Just tell me the truth." Gideon hesitated for too long. And Carrie saw it. For the first time, she saw through him. Who the hell is Celeste? Gideon exhaled slowly. This was the moment he had always feared. And for the first time, he had no escape route. He could have confessed. He could have told her everything. But that wasn't who he was. Gideon Hawthorne was a man who never let the truth catch up to him. So he did what he had always done. He calculated. "She's an old girlfriend," he said, keeping his voice steady. "It ended years ago, but she's been struggling. I helped her financially a few times." Carrie's eyes flashed with something new, something Gideon didn't recognize. "You're lying." Not a question, a statement. And for the first time, Gideon felt something he never had before. Not just the fear of getting caught, something worse. He was losing control. August 24th. Gideon had no idea that every single mistake he had made, every crack in his perfectly constructed world, was about to come crashing down all at once. That night, he was supposed to be at the American Airlines Excellence in Aviation Gala, held at the Dallas Fairmont Hotel. He had been nominated for Pilot of the Year, a prestigious award, a public moment of glory. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have planned for, was that both Celeste and Carrie were about to be in the same building. Celeste had planned to be in San Francisco that week, attending a neurosurgical conference. But then, a strange medical billing error caught her attention. She started digging, and the more she uncovered, the worse it got. Duplicate charges from Chicago, hotel bookings she never knew about, a credit card statement with flights that didn't match his schedule. So she changed her plans. Instead of staying in San Francisco, she booked a last-minute flight to Dallas. She was going to confront him. Carrie had never been part of Gideon's professional world. She had never attended an airline event. But that night, she had decided to surprise him. Her belly was 7 months swollen with his twins. She had bought a new dress, something elegant, something that made her feel like she belonged in his world. She wanted to stand beside him, proud, glowing, showing the world the family they were about to become. She had no idea that another woman had booked a flight for the same reason. 8:42 p.m. Gideon had just stepped out of the pilot's briefing room, smoothing his uniform, preparing for his moment on stage. The gala was in full swing. His phone buzzed. A text from Carrie. "Just got to the hotel. Where are you?" And then before he could respond, a voice, behind him, Celeste's voice. "Who is Isla Carrington Hawthorne?" The words struck like lightning. The hotel lobby fell silent. And then, as if fate had orchestrated the most perfect storm, a third voice. "Carrie's. Gideon? Baby? Where are you?" And she stepped into the light, 7 months pregnant, smiling, until she saw Celeste, until she saw the way Celeste was looking at her, until she looked at Gideon's face, the way all the blood had drained from it, until she saw the truth in real time. Celeste's breath shook. "You're having his baby?" she whispered. Carrie looked between them, confusion melting into horror. "What the hell is happening?" Gideon opened his mouth, but for the first time in his life, no words came out, no excuse, no lie, no manipulation could save him now, because the two lives he had spent years constructing had just met face to face, and there was no way out. Security footage from the Fairmont Hotel lobby would later be dissected by FBI analysts, true crime reporters, and aviation officials. It captured the moment Gideon tried to step forward, the moment both women realized they were married to the same man, the moment Celeste whispered, through gritted teeth, "You are going to burn for this." And then, as if the universe itself decided to end his deception once and for all, Carrie doubled over in pain. Her hands went to her stomach. She gasped, "Gideon, something's wrong. It's the babies." And that was it. That was the exact second where the life Gideon Hawthorne had spent years building collapsed. There would be no recovery, no escape, no safe landing. The grand ballroom at the Dallas Fairmont Hotel had hosted countless elegant events, but never a scene like this. 300 of aviation's elite stood frozen, watching the public unraveling of Captain Gideon Hawthorne, a man who had spent his life navigating the skies with precision, but had just crashed and burned in the most spectacular way possible. At the center of it all, Celeste Marino, the perfect neurosurgeon wife, standing in stunned silence, her mind calculating every moment, every lie that had brought her to this moment. Carrie Carrington, the free-spirited artist, clutching her pregnant belly in pain, her world shattering in real time as she tried to process the impossible truth that she wasn't Gideon's only wife. And Gideon Hawthorne, standing between them, his meticulously constructed reality collapsing around him, unable to control the inevitable fallout. The silence of the ballroom was shattered by Kari's gasp of pain. Her legs buckled. She grabbed Gideon's arm, her breath ragged. "Gideon, something's wrong, it's the babies." And suddenly Celeste's training kicked in. She wasn't a betrayed wife anymore. She was a doctor first. The hotel lobby exploded into chaos. Guests scrambled, phones emerged, cameras flashing, live streaming the downfall of one of aviation's golden boys. Celeste barked orders like she was in an operating room. Get her on the ground. Elevate her legs. Someone call an ambulance. Now! Security personnel blocked Gideon from following as paramedics rushed Carrie out of the ballroom. Let me through, Gideon demanded, his voice filled with raw desperation. But Celeste stepped in front of him. For the first time, he wasn't in control. And just like that, the weight of his crimes crashed down on him. Gideon Hawthorne was not handcuffed at the scene. Not yet. But as he stood in the hotel lobby, frozen in place, his life spiraling beyond his control, the cracks in his world finished breaking apart. Because at that moment, in a federal office 1,000 miles away, the FAA received a report, a file full of flight irregularities, fraud, and falsified documentation. And the FBI had already been watching. At Rush University Medical Center, Carrie was rushed into emergency surgery. Her blood pressure was dangerously high. The twins were in distress. Celeste, still in her evening gown from the gala, stood in the observation room, her arms folded, watching through the glass as doctors worked to save the woman Gideon had betrayed her for. A thought flashed through her mind, one she would never admit out loud. Those babies should have been mine. But then, as the first tiny newborn was lifted into the air, crying, the bitterness left her, because this wasn't their fault. And Celeste Moreno wasn't a woman who punished the innocent. Meanwhile, Gideon was staring at his phone, his hands trembling. Every instinct in him screamed, run. Get to an airport. Change your identity. Escape. But it was already too late, because the FBI had arrived. A pair of agents in dark suits stepped forward, flashing badges. Captain Hawthorne, we need you to come with us. Gideon stared, blinking. The words didn't feel real. This wasn't supposed to happen to him. But it was. Gideon Hawthorne was officially grounded. His American Airlines credentials were revoked. The FAA launched a full-scale investigation, combing through years of flight logs, financial records, and flight schedules. And what they found was even worse than expected. Gideon hadn't just been lying about his wives. He had been manipulating airline schedules, forging flight hours, altering layover details, moving money through a network of shell accounts to maintain two separate lives. And worst of all, he had been violating airline rest regulations, flying when he was supposed to be grounded, meaning he had put passengers' lives at risk. The trial of Gideon Hawthorne was one of the most sensational aviation scandals in history. Celeste was the first to take the stand. The courtroom was silent as she spoke. My husband didn't just deceive me. He didn't just break my heart. He violated FAA regulations, falsified records, and risked lives just to maintain his lies. Her hands trembled, but her voice was like steel. The man I married didn't exist. He was as fictional as his flight logs. Carrie testified next, appearing via video from her home. The camera framed her softly, a woman who had been betrayed but survived. Her twins were asleep in the next room. I believed him. I believed we were building a life together. But the truth is, I was just part of his elaborate fantasy. She wiped a tear but never broke down. He didn't just lie to us, he lied to the entire world. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Their verdict was unanimous. Guilty. Gideon Hawthorne was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. His FAA pilot's license was revoked for life. His name became synonymous with deception, fraud, and betrayal. Celeste never responded to his letters. Instead, she channeled her pain into her work, becoming the youngest chief of neurosurgery at UCSF. Carrie, meanwhile, moved to Maine. She opened a smaller art gallery, raising her sons in peace. Her most famous painting, a haunting, fractured portrait of a man with 2 faces and broken wings, sold for enough to fund her children's college education. She never spoke to Gideon again. In the end, Gideon Hawthorne was just another inmate, a man who had once controlled everything, now a man who had nothing. He spent hours in his cell, folding paper airplanes, launching them between prison bars and watching them fall. In the end, Captain Gideon Hawthorne, once an aviation golden boy, didn't crash in the cockpit of a plane. He crashed in the courtroom. He crashed in his own deception. He crashed in the 2 women who had loved him, only to find they had been living inside a lie. And now, as the world moved on without him, Gideon sat inside a prison cell, far from the skies he once commanded. His legacy wasn't one of skill or brilliance or success. His legacy was a cautionary tale. The prison was not kind to Gideon Hawthorne. He had once been a man who lived in 2 worlds, effortlessly navigating between them. Now, his world was 8 by 10 feet. A thin mattress, a metal toilet, a barred window that didn't face the sky. He no longer had control. His days were routine, repetitive, suffocating. He spent hours in the prison yard, pacing the same concrete space over and over again, an infinite loop, a flight path with no destination. But what disturbed the guards the most was the paper airplanes. Every night, Gideon would fold them, small, white, perfectly symmetrical, with surgical precision the same way he had once crafted his double life. He would launch them through the bars of his cell, watching them flutter uselessly to the ground, over and over and over, like a man reliving his own downfall in slow motion. From prison, Gideon wrote to both Celeste and Carrie. They were identical letters, 6 pages long, handwritten, every sentence meticulously constructed, just like everything else he had ever done. He tried to explain himself, to justify, to control the narrative one last time. I loved you both. Celeste was my ambition, my stability. Carrie was my passion, my escape. I needed both to feel whole. I'm sorry I couldn't choose. But neither woman responded. They didn't need to, because Gideon Hawthorne was a man who had already been erased from their lives. After the trial, Celeste threw herself into her work. When asked about her past, she never spoke about Gideon. She never told new colleagues about the betrayal. She had surgically removed him from her life, the same way she saved lives in the operating room. Carrie moved to Maine. She opened a small, quiet art gallery, tucked away from the noise of the world. Her twins, Alexander and Adrian, grew up surrounded by color and creativity, never knowing the man who had given them their name. And when people asked about Gideon Hawthorne, she simply said, he was a pilot, but he forgot how to land. If you found this story interesting, please hit the like button and leave a comment below. Also, don't forget to subscribe for more daily chilling true crime stories on love, betrayal, and revenge. See you on the next one.